All right, so peace. Uh, this episode of the Morning News, they've had a lot of great stories. This one is on John F. Kennedy. So I'm going to let them tell their version. I'm going to chime in here and there.
The 29th of this month marks the 100th anniversary of the birth of our 35th president, John F. Kennedy. That's the subject of our commentary from Tom Oliphant, co-author of the new book, The Road to Camelot. We should note it's published by CBS's Simon & Schuster.
Until a couple of years ago, I had no idea that John Kennedy rejected Lyndon Johnson barely 2 hours before he picked him as his running mate.
Let me say this. I didn't know that either, that he had rejected Lyndon Baines Johnson to be his running mate. But it didn't surprise me that he picked him. He most likely was told to pick Lyndon Johnson after Lyndon chose to accept, because they already had foreknowledge that Lyndon Baines Johnson was going to be the president. All right. That's why Lyndon Baines Johnson changed his mind. He most likely was told by his backers that, we're going to make you president. Just sit tight. Lyndon Baines Johnson, for those who don't know, was a socialist. All right. That means what? He was backed by the international bankers. He also was allegedly a Zionist. I don't know how true that is, but most of these presidents are Zionists. Nobody should be incredulous about that. There's a reason why every last president has to go to Israel and go by the Wailing Wall and put a yarmulke on. All right. They're all Zionists. They're all bought and paid for. But Lyndon Baines Johnson already knew that Kennedy was going to be put to death after a while. All right. He helped preside over it. Lyndon Baines Johnson was a socialist. That's why he started that program called the Great Society. If I remember correctly, it was called. All right. His job was to bring so-called blacks into the fold of America.
He and his brother Robert had falsely assumed for months that Johnson didn't want the Veep spot. But when JFK suddenly realized Johnson was in fact lusting for the job, he and his brother batted it around, but decided they really didn't want Johnson. The issue was trust. Still,
They were right to not trust him. That man was a serpent.
They needed a way to placate the powerful Texan if they didn't pick him, but failed to find it. As Bob Kennedy ruefully put it, we came up with the idea of trying to get rid of him, and it didn't work. These bits of history are hardly deep, dark secrets. They have been hiding in plain sight for decades, mostly at the Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, an amazing collection of some 25 million pieces of paper and more than 1,600 detailed oral histories.
Yeah, they need to tell a lot of detailed oral histories. There's a lot of stuff to tell about John F. Kennedy, right? Got a lot of dirt on that guy.
What astonished my writing partner, Curtis Wilkie, and me was that this gigantic record is largely untouched, and more stuff is becoming available all the time. Burrowing in those 60-year-old files, we discovered that Kennedy's beloved father was welcomed for his money much more than for his advice.
John F. Kennedy's dad wanted to be the first Catholic president. All right, but he had too much dirt on him. He was a bootlegger. All right. Might have been a bootlicker too. Who knows? But he was a bootlegger. All right. That's how many of these affluent northern families got their start. A lot of the affluent southern families got their start through oil. A lot of the northern Caucasian rich families got their start through a bootlegging. All right. And, and hustling and other forms of illicit activity. And of course, the Caucasian Jews, they got most of their money through banking and jewelry dealing. If you notice, most of the Caucasian Jews have last names that revolve around money, right? Gold, Goldman, Silverman, Ruby, Diamond. Those are oftentimes their last name, right? Green. Understand? They didn't have last names until the late 1700s, early 1800s. They made those last names up. Okay? Rubenstein. The name Rubenstein means ruby stone. Okay? They worship money. It is what it is. They're the ones who picked the name. Don't get mad at me. They picked the name. Perlman. Right? Pearl Man.
We even found evidence that candidate Kennedy knew all about the looming Bay of Pigs invasion from his friends, not the CIA.
What is the Bay of Pigs? That was a big that was a big fuck up, for lack of a better term. If you know anything about the so-called Bay of Pigs, allegedly that was supposed to be a CIA organized or orchestrated attack on Fidel Castro. It was all BS. It was set up to fail. The CIA and the international bankers, they wanted Fidel Castro to control Cuba because he was a communist. All right. Communism is the chosen form of government for the bankers. That's what they want. Why? Because the government basically takes all the money away from its citizens and just has you working all day on the land. Okay. They destroy all classes. They just have you working all day on your commune. That's it. But the Bay of Pigs, that was set up to fail. That was controlled by the head of the CIA at the time. I believe his name was Allen Dulles. And I believe that the airport at Washington, D.C. was named after him for a while. His brother's name was John Foster Dulles. They both were members of the Council of Foreign Relations. And they both were involved in the meeting for the League of Nations, if I remember correctly, right, in 1917. All right, so they go way back. Remember, Kennedy came into power in 1961. So the Dulles brothers were around for a long time. Allen Dulles was put in charge of the CIA, and John Foster Dulles, I believe, was involved with banking, if I remember correctly. All right, but they both were members of the Council of Foreign Relations. Anyway, they brought information to Allen Dulles that Castro was a communist, and he shelved it. He already knew. All right. Their job was to make sure that he got into power. All right. The people that they so-called armed to go fight at the Bay of Pigs, first off, they had a better landing site that they should have chosen, which is the city of Trinidad, Cuba, which is farther away from the capital city of Havana. But they chose to attack at the Bay of Pigs. Why? Because they wanted it to fail. All right. They didn't provide air cover. They didn't provide anything. That whole thing was set up to fail. And so was the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was set up to fail too. All right. And Kennedy even said a little bit before he was killed that he believed that the United States was involved with creating the entire Castro regime. See, Kennedy was a little bit in over his head. He didn't realize what he had gotten himself into until it got a little too late. That's why they blew his brains out. All right. Allegedly.
The Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon.
Richard Nixon, a member of the Bohemian Grove. Big pedophile, this guy. Allegedly, all right? Allegedly. Big pedophile, allegedly. Caught up in all type of madness. This guy betrayed that, simple brother, Jackie Robinson.
And his own polls showed that while Richard Nixon certainly looked terrible during those famous debates, they barely affected the horse race.
Richard Nixon, he looked at so-called blacks as like little babies. He thought that so-called blacks were totally incapable of doing anything of worthiness or notice other than for entertainment.
This is the tip of an immense iceberg. Our little book is just a start. There is still a ton of work to do. Yeah. JFK also was a sex addict, by the way. All right. He used to like to have sex with pubescent girls, little MK Ultra girls. They used to have something called, if I remember correctly, it was the shuttle run, where they would have little girls get into his limo, and he would have sex with the little girls in the back seat of the limo. All right. Marilyn Monroe, for those of you who don't know, was a MK Ultra monarch child. She was put under the sex kitten programming. Her and Eartha Kitt, they were two of the early sex kittens that were rolled out, but Marilyn Monroe was a diamond level sex kitten. All right, meaning she was a like all the processes worked. They worked on her. Okay, but she was diamond level programmed. She's considered the cream of the crop. Like that's why she had that song "Diamonds Are Girls' Best Friend." Remember, I told you that the diamond is the favorite jewel of the goddess Venus, who's the goddess of love and also the goddess of lust and sex.
these women that are in the Monarch program, or pardon me, the MK Ultra program and Monarch programming, one of their altars is that sex altar, is that goddess altar. Right? Same thing with Beyonce. Beyonce is a sex kitten as well. Rihanna, basically every famous starlet that you see. All right. Beyonce's first handler was her father, Matthew Knowles, allegedly. All right. She got passed to Jay-Z. You'll always see these Monarch children, these sex kittens, they get passed from man to man. Almost all famous men, like Marilyn Monroe. She got passed from Arthur Miller to, I believe it was Joe DiMaggio, to Arthur Miller to JFK. Right? She was just an asset. All right. Yeah, but that's it on that. And as you can see, they have their sun worship emblem again. But yeah, Kennedy was, their family tried to work their way in. They were like, the Kennedy family was like the so-called Democrat version of the Bush family. All right, the Bush family was another family who slithered their way into the upper circles. But the Kennedy family, they didn't really realize what they were getting into until it was too late. That's why they had to kill both John Kennedy and his brother Robert. I believe his brother Robert was killed by somebody named Sirhan, who was a mind control assassin. All right, that's the mind control assassination or assassins are known as Delta programmed. That's why they make movies like Jason Bourne. They show you the brain control, or pardon me, the mind control techniques that they use on these people in the movies. Remember, they took Jason Bourne, they dumped his head into the tank to try to drown him. Part of the training, the torture training, things of that nature. But yeah, they sent people like what's the cat name that they say killed Kennedy, the lone gunman. Damn, I don't know why this guy's name is slipping my mind right now. Damn, what's his name? Lee Harvey Oswald. That's it. He was he was a patsy that was set up. Lee Harvey Oswald. And you'll notice oftentimes when it comes to these assassins, they always give them three names: Lee Harvey Oswald, and what's the cat name that killed the dude, John Lennon? Damn, what's that dude name? I don't know. All these names are slipping my mind, brothers. I'm sorry. Y'all could look it up. But point being, JFK, he was a little in over his head, and Lyndon B. Johnson knew all about it. Lyndon B. Johnson knew that he was going to be allowed to ascend to the presidency if JFK didn't follow instructions. That's why he changed course so quick. All right, Lyndon B. Johnson was a Wiccan, and he also was a pawn of the international bankers. I mentioned that before. That's why they used him to bring in a lot of those civil rights reforms. All right, they wanted to bring so-called blacks into the fold so that they all could be mass programmed with everybody else. All right, peace. Oh, now I remember. John David Chapman? Some Chapman, the guy who killed John Lennon. I believe his name was Chapman. Or was that the guy who tried to assassinate Reagan? One of them. Anyway, peace.